Thanks, everyone. My name is Jason Grillo, and I am a volunteer with the OpenAir Collective. Although my regular work, I work with a group called AirMiners, focused on carbon dioxide removal. Here today to talk about the Massachusetts Carbon Dioxide Removal Leadership Act, S2096, introduced by Senate Majority Leader Creem in the Massachusetts Senate. Just want to say thank you so much to everybody who has taken the time to join us today to watch, and thank you to those who have made today possible. Thank you to our hosts and panelists. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Senator Creem, who can talk a little bit about the act. Just to note, today's presentation is being recorded, and we'll make that available at a couple of days afterwards. Also, for the run of show today, first we're going to have Senator Creem give some remarks. Then I will talk along with Chris Neidl about carbon removal and the CDRLA S2096 policy. And then we'll have some panelists come in toward the end. And then for the last 15 minutes, we'll conclude with some Q&A, and then we'll be out in 60 minutes total. So without any further delay, just want to say thank you again. And Senator Creem, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us this morning to learn about carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, and to hear about this legislation. I filed to make Massachusetts a national leader in advancing CDR innovation and governance. I want to thank Chris and Toby from OpenAir and Jason from AirMiners for helping organize today's event, and to all the terrific speakers we'll be hearing from later. There's no question that the world needs carbon dioxide removal. The most recent assessment from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change makes explicitly clear that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius cannot be done without removing the significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The Commonwealth, too, has recognized that CDR will be necessary to achieving its mandate of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We have long planned to achieve net zero in Massachusetts by slashing emissions by 85% and netting out the remaining 15% through natural and working lands, the forests, oceans, and other natural resources that sequester carbon dioxide. However, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs informed my committee last year that the sequestration capacity of natural and working lands may not be great enough to net out the 15% of emissions in its entirety. That's why the Commonwealth's Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2050 stated that some combination of engineering carbon dioxide removal and out-of-state nature-based carbon sequestration will likely be necessary to meet net zero in 2050. The CECP further stated that the Commonwealth can contribute to CDR technology development by providing dedicated research and developing funding and proper policy support, with the goal of decreasing the cost of engineering CDR solutions over time. And that's exactly what the legislation I filed will do. Chris and Jason will go into more detail about the bill, but in short, it would direct Mass CEC to create a pilot program through which Massachusetts will make advanced commitments to purchase carbon removal from a wide range of products. The bill includes safeguards to ensure that we advance CDR in a way that is consistent with our environmental and economic justice values. And it makes clear that any project that perpetuates the use of fossil fuels would be ineligible to participate. Ineligible. I'm really excited about the bill's potential to make Massachusetts a national and global leader in CDR innovation, and its potential as an economic development tool for every region of the Commonwealth. As you will hear later, there are already CDR companies headquartered in Massachusetts or deploying projects here, but there's much room for more growth. We can deploy enhanced weathering and biochar CDR solutions in agricultural communities on the South Coast, in the Merrimack Valley, and in the central and western Massachusetts. We can launch ocean-based CDR projects in communities all along our hundreds of miles of coastline. And we can begin producing and using concrete and other products that are made with carbon sequestered from the atmosphere. When it comes to addressing climate change, our first order of priority is and will continue to be decarbonizing every sector we can through energy efficiency, renewable energy, and electrification. But there will be industries and activities for which completely eliminating emissions will be immensely difficult or downright impossible. To reach net zero, or to go beyond net zero and reduce the damage we've already done to our climate, we will have to counterbalance those emissions through carbon removal. We need to start supporting and scaling our CDR solutions now. And my bill, Senate 2096, provides the framework for doing so in a responsible manner. So again, thank you for joining us this morning. I hope you'll consider co-sponsoring the bill, which will be up for hearing this week. Now back to you, Jason. Again, thank you for allowing me to present my bill.
Senator Creem, thank you so much. Just as a couple of housekeeping notes, first of all, Senator Creem, as we all know, is the Senate Majority Leader and has a long history of environmental interest in her pursuits in the legislature. Also, for those in the audience, I would note that the Q&A button is the best method to ask questions of the panel and of us as event organizers. So use that as a means of asking whatever you'd like to during the course of the webinar today. So what I'm going to do now is go into a little bit about what CDR is and is not, and also outline a little bit about why it's important for Massachusetts. For me, this is quite interesting because even though I currently live in Washington State, I grew up in Massachusetts. I grew up in Linfield, and went to college in the state and lived there for several years. So, and have most of my family and many, many, many friends. So this has a good deal of personal meaning to me to be here. So thank you for that. The Massachusetts Carbon Removal Leadership Act, as we know, introduced by Senator Creem. A little bit about OpenAir, which is the group that's leading the volunteer grassroots effort. It's a volunteer-led advocacy organization to advance policies to support carbon removal activities and policies in the United States and around the world. What is carbon removal? Here we see carbon removal is activities that remove CO2 from the atmosphere and durably store it in geological, terrestrial, or ocean reservoirs or in products. That's from the CDR primer that has been first authored by Jennifer Wilcox, who's now at the Department of Energy in the Fossil Energy and Carbon Management Division. Why is this important? Because, well, the IPCC several years ago indicated that the pathways that limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius rely on removing excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over the course of the 21st century. That is the pathway that gets us to carbon removal is necessary in order to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius of removal. What carbon removal is not is a substitute for avoiding emissions to begin with. We need to, as the senator mentioned, decarbonize our society. We need to avoid emissions going up into the atmosphere to begin with. We need carbon-free energy sources. We need electric vehicles. We need them, well, really 20 years ago, but we need to deploy them as rapidly as we can today going forward. That said, carbon removal is not a substitute to stopping emissions going up to the atmosphere. the estimate is that 80 to 90% of the work of decarbonizing is going to come up to stopping emissions to begin with. Carbon removal is also not a substitute for adaptation. Here, depicting the response to the effects of climate change, such as flooding, is shown here. But carbon removal is also not a moral hazard. You might hear that it's a way of getting polluters off the hook. Not at all. It is a way of, as a colleague of mine puts it, cleaning up the big carbon spill in the sky that we've created for ourselves over the last couple of centuries of industrial activity. So carbon removal is also not point source capture. You might hear the term CCS, or carbon capture and storage, mentioned. That is a different activity. The target of carbon removal really is the ambient greenhouse gas up in the atmosphere, the trillion tons that, again, has been kind of spilled up into the atmosphere over the course of time. That means that we need to clean that up as much as possible. While CCS is important as an avoidance mechanism, meaning putting, say, a scrubber on top of a flue gas smokestack, it's not really what we consider to be carbon removal. Once again, the goal is to take the greenhouse gas in the atmosphere itself and then draw that down and put it into carbon sinks or storage. Carbon removal is most helpful for taking care of difficult to abate emissions, as the Senator mentioned. Places like aviation, heavy industry, or agriculture, where we're not going to be able to stop emissions to begin with. That's where carbon removal is going to be necessary in order to reach that net zero and ultimately net negative future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's also, again, a way of taking care of legacy emissions. We're already at an unsafe number of parts per million in the atmosphere, and we want to, again, draw that down to a more livable future. This chart best depicts what the curve looks like. Many of you might have seen some different version of this in various presentations. The yellow and the gray show the emissions that we are doing year over year today. And that will have to get drawn down, that will have to get stopped from going up into the atmosphere over the course of the next several decades to reach a emissions point that's as low as we can manage. The green below the bar shows what happens so that we can draw down the emissions that we have no way of abating, that we have no way of stopping going up into the atmosphere to begin with, just because the technology is not quite there yet. That's where carbon removal comes in. Ultimately, over the course of the second half of the century is where we will have to truly deploy carbon removal even more in order to reach a net negative society, which draws down the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. So the bottom line is now we need massive scale of avoidance and decarbonization to get, again, those carbon-free energy sources and electric vehicles and other means of stopping emissions to begin with scaled up. And also now we need to do the R&D and get the standards in place, start to commercialize and really reduce the cost of carbon removal methods so that in the future we can even more so achieve a net zero and ultimately a net negative state where we are drawing down carbon from the atmosphere so that we can, in the second half of the century, start to really scale up carbon removal. Virtually all of the carbon removal today comes from conventional land management. Again, as the Senator mentioned in the hearing from a little while ago, this is also reinforced by the State of Carbon Removal report that was released earlier this year. And then a maximum of 40% of the necessary carbon removal can be achieved through these natural sinks. So for the rest of the necessary CDR, novel CDR is going to be necessary. And that includes biomass with carbon removal and storage, or BECCS plants, biochar, mineralization, ocean CDR, and direct air capture, all of which we're going to hear about in short order from our panel later today. Furthermore, the industrial opportunity here is vast. The economists estimated not too long ago that carbon removal could become $1 trillion business, so that there's significant economic opportunity as well as the ability to provide a profound environmental benefit across the world. The next decade is going to be crucial, as I mentioned, so that we can start to reduce costs and get carbon removal methods standardized and up and running, so that in the second half of the century, we can have even more substantial deployment. But right now, we need to get the industry moving even quicker than it already has. So far, innovation has gone at an incredibly rapid pace over the last 2 or 3 years, ever since the original IPCC report was released in 2019. There have been $4 billion announced in public funding in R&D, investments flowing into the space, and there's been an incredible rise in patents. That said, even more needs to happen. Policy interventions are a crucial measure here to, for one thing, decarbonize, but also enable us to ramp up the necessary carbon removal in order to reduce costs, get regulations in place, and enable these fledgling companies to start to commercialize their technologies. Catalytic leadership, as quoted by Greg Nemeth here, means that there's significant opportunity for particular jurisdictions to play a leading role. In the previous decades, Germany played an outsized role in jumpstarting the solar industry to get to a point today where we are decades ahead of even of forecasts in terms of cost per solar unit. Denmark similarly played a leading role in being able to revolutionize the wind industry. And that means that it falls to states in the United States, such as Massachusetts, which are crucial jurisdictions for making this happen. The world-class research institutions, human capital, natural resources, as well as a long history of innovation leadership, make the Commonwealth an ideal place for carbon removal to take root, develop, and grow. And with a little bit more about what S2096 will mean for that effort, I'm going to hand the stage over to Chris Neidl at OpenAir Collective and Rethinking Removals. Chris?
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Excellent, excellent summary. Really excited to just go over some of the fundamentals of the objectives of this bill, the rationale for it, and the mechanics of it. But I do want to also really restate leadership is right there in the act. And we really do want to commend the leadership of Senator Creem, who got this early on and really embraced it in every single possible way. And without her leadership, we would not be having this conversation. So I'll just go over here quickly. If you want to go ahead and move to the next slide, Jason. Great. So what this bill does, and it is very novel. What we're talking about here is we're seeing policies really now being discussed all over the world. It's widely accepted that carbon removal has to be part of the overall picture of achieving net zero globally on the local level. But we're having a dearth of actual states take a lead and really push forward on getting this catalyzed. And what we're seeing happen in Massachusetts is remarkable, not just in the context of the US, but globally. And the world is definitely watching. So what this bill does is we'll describe is it takes a procurement model, state procurement model, which is a tool that's been used in innovation, specifically within climate tech on the national and subnational level. It's a key route to catalyzing new markets. And that is the playbook that we're following for this policy. Next slide. And in terms of the core objectives, why this bill is relevant, there's sort of 3 buckets that we can think of this in. One is that we do think, as Jason and Senator Creem both spelled out very directly, this isn't a nice to have. We think that this is absolutely fundamental to achieving actual, real, science-aligned net zero goals. So this is absolutely relevant to the larger climate picture and commitments that Massachusetts has signed up to. As Jason also laid out, this is a massive future trillion-dollar industry. And right now, very few places are really trying to seize the mantle. So a policy like this, the way it's designed, really does put Massachusetts on the map and leverages the incredible competitive advantages it can have to play a leadership role in this sector. And then what we also want to point out is that because the stage that the sector is at, this is designed in a way to learn, to really explore and develop experience that will allow for larger scale policies to be implemented in the future. The rationale for it, again, it's a procurement policy, is that it really wants to strategically target public resources in a way that will have a meaningful impact on creating demand for carbon dioxide removal here in the state, which is a really important feature of it. This will give rise to a variety of different forms of CDR projects here in Massachusetts. We also think that a procurement model allows for a maximum amount of transparency and to make sure values and commitments that align with the public good are most directly integrated into market development strategies. And it also has a strong element of making sure that we select for those high impact solutions that are most cost competitive. And the other thing that we really benefit from is that in the private sector, there's been an enormous amount of innovation around carbon removal purchasing. There's been some of the largest tech companies in the world, like Microsoft and Meta and Stripe and Google, have already started to create a playbook for us about how do we actually buy carbon removal that is going to help us achieve our goals in a really high impactful way. So we're not starting from scratch with this bill. Next slide. And in terms of the actual elements of it, and this is we can get into more deeply, and I'll have one of our members can drop a brief of the bill of all these pieces that I'm about to mention. But again, the key piece to it is to be able to create demand by deploying public monies to buy carbon removal. And so it's not only to buy any carbon removal, but to buy those, again, that are locally enacted, that are locally implemented. So it has a creating demand, but creating demand for these types of projects here in the state. Next. And a really key part, as you'll hear from our panel, and you got a little preview of from Jason, is that there are many different forms of carbon removal. This is very much a spectrum-based phenomena that's happening. There's a wide variety of different forms of carbon removal that happen on land and ocean that integrate with working lands and industry. We don't want to pick winners. We want to be able to create standards that say what is good, socially beneficial, climate beneficial forms of carbon removal. Let's put those standards and then select for those rather than specific technologies. Next. And the other part too is that while cost is absolutely key here, we want to make sure that we do something that's fiscally responsible and is going to deliver the highest impact at the most reasonable cost. But we also want to make sure that we account for other types of benefits that come from carbon removal, including job creation. Are there quantifiable environmental and social benefits that happen in various different parts of the state? And all of that can be added to the quote unquote scorecard that could be used for selecting through a procurement model. Next. And we also, this is both a feature of the standards-based and tech agnosticism, that we want many different types of carbon removal that correspond to the unique resources that Massachusetts has. But we also want to make sure that it's not just large projects that happen. We want to make sure that certain smaller projects that can be owned by communities, projects that can fit into and benefit different types of communities in different ways, are also going to be part of the selection process. So variety and diversity is a really important feature. Next. And then a key part that is embedded throughout the bill at every phase is that rather than just implementing what a small group of regulators determine might be the best ways of doing it from a very early phase, from the very beginning, before procurement actually happens, is broad consultation with different communities around the state, and to also ensure that there's a strict do no harm standards. There's involvement of environmental justice officers within the state will be directly involved in the actual criteria for selection. And so this is embedded into the bill at every different phase, from pre-procurement through actual program implementation. And next. And we also think it's appropriate, given the stage the carbon removal is at, and as I said, it's about learning and gaining experience, This bill authorizes procurement for a 5-year period so that standards can be created, experience can be gained, and then that gives us a moment in 5 years to determine what scale do we want to incorporate CDR at. So it limits it to an initial 5-year authorization. And next. And this is also, this bill, because it's a 5-year authorization and it starts with relatively small amounts of procurement and then ramps up during that 5 years, it's a fiscally inexpensive program, under $50 million over the course of the entire 5-year period. And that's a small amount, but it's enough to be catalytic. It's enough to learn a lot and to get projects out into the world, specifically in Massachusetts. And the funding mechanism for this is by itself a win for the climate. And it's about revoking certain existing tax credit for commercial aviation fuel that are already in place, which is, again, a win for the climate in any event. And the extra revenues that are gained from that would actually be deployed to pay for this program. And so that's just an overview, again, of the rationale and how the bill would work. And that's just a nice summary of it. Again, we've included the legislative brief in the chat, which goes a little bit deeper into each of those boxes, as well as a copy of the bill itself. So with that, Jason, I'll pass it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So with that, I just want to say thanks so much. We are at the end of our slide presentation right now. And thanks to those of you who have asked comments into the chat or into the Q&A. Right now, we're going to turn to a panel conversation. One of the things that came up in Senator's comments, my comments, what Chris added, is that there's a lot of potential for business growth and to add jobs in the state as well. And to that end, we have some thought leaders who are active in carbon removal along various lines here today. Now, just do a quick intro to each of them so that we can unpack some of the opportunities that their respective methods of carbon removal offer, so that we can we can impart that understanding to you, our audience. So first, Dr. Sandra Whitehouse is a consultant who uses her marine science expertise to advise clients on ocean-based policies, focus on how to advance advance ocean health and sustainably develop coastal and offshore projects. Her clients include governments, companies, and nonprofits. Currently, she serves as a policy advisor to Running Tide, which is an exciting ocean-based carbon removal company. Dr. Whitehouse holds a BS from Yale University and a PhD from the Graduate School of Oceanography at University of Rhode Island. Conor, and next we have Conor Cooper. Conor is the head of business development for the low-carbon concrete technology company CarbonBuilt. With nearly 20 years of experience in concrete products, Conor has led both manufacturing and distribution businesses and oversaw Northeast business for Old Scale APG prior to joining CarbonBuilt, including a mix of masonry, hardscape, and dry mix concrete plants. He also spent 5 years on the board of directors for Interlocking Concrete Pavement Institute, including time on the executive committee as the association's treasurer and secretary. Also, Conor, you are a resident of the South Shore, in Cohasset. Finally, to talk about working lands, we've got Dr. Noah Planovsky, who's a professor of geochemistry at the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Yale University. He's an assistant curator of mineralogy at Yale Peabody Museum and a senior contributing research scientist at Environmental Defense Fund. He's on the steering committee for the Yale Center for Natural Carbon Capture. He uses empirical measurements and geochemical modeling to track the carbon cycle, demonstrating a track record of research at the forefront of understanding carbon dioxide regulation through weathering, the mechanics of enhanced weathering in natural managed soils, and the downstream fate of captured carbon in natural systems. So right now we're going to have a chat for a little while. Curious if you could, for the panel, if you could unpack what your really briefly, what your respective approaches to carbon removal represent and what their impact might be on the state of Massachusetts. If you want, yeah,
I can
please,
jump
Noah.
in first. Yeah, well, thanks so much for organizing, and thank you, Senator, for being a leader in the space. So I'm really interested in turning agricultural systems from being a large source of greenhouse gases into being centers of carbon dioxide removal, and especially focusing on soil pH regulation, focusing on weathering, which is a process that happens naturally, focused on speeding that up through through modification of agricultural practices to permanently remove carbon. So we've been working with feedstock and with rock from Massachusetts for a couple years now in a wide range of areas, and interested in northeastern farms in applying rocks to fields to permanently capture carbon dioxide through this weathering process. And there's 7,000 farms in Massachusetts, roughly. And many of those are small farms where view carbon dioxide removal for these farms as not only being something that improves their soil health, potentially in many cases will improve their yields, but also can provide an extra source of income for small, many cases, family farms that are struggling to make ends meet every year. So I was extremely excited to have something in opportunity to take the research we've been doing over the past decade and see that continue to grow in a way that removes carbon and as importantly helps farmers.
Great. Dr. Whitehouse, please.
Yeah, I think maybe I will go from land to sea there. I just would like to start with a quote from one of my heroes, former Secretary John Kerry, who's now the U.S. climate envoy, and I believe is still a professor at Yale. And he has said many times, you can't solve the problem of the ocean without dealing with climate, and you can't solve the problem of climate without dealing with the ocean. And basically, what this means is while the ocean's been a victim of climate change with respect to ocean acidification and increased water temperature, it also presents this enormous opportunity to mitigate climate change, including through carbon dioxide removal. I think we saw earlier the slide about getting to negative emissions. Well, in order to do that, we're going to really need to responsibly use the ocean. So, the ocean is the largest, with all due respect to terrestrial folks, and we need to do all of the above at this point. The ocean is the largest carbon sink, with most of the carbon actually stored in the deep sea sediments through this natural cycle that we refer to as the biological carbon pump. And basically what Running Tide is trying to do is work with nature and harness two of its greatest forces, sunlight and gravity, to basically amplify this pump by sinking seaweed and some terrestrial biomass. Just to give sort of a thumbnail sketch of the biological pump in the ocean, plants are growing in the surface waters where there's light, which they need to grow, obviously, either as tiny phytoplankton or as seaweeds. Those plants are then eaten by other creatures, which might be eaten by other creatures up the food chain. But carbon basically gets pumped to the bottom in one of two ways. Either those creatures die and their bodies fall to the bottom of the ocean and become part of the sediment, or what we would say in science, the fecal matter falls to the bottom, i.e. they poop and that falls to the bottom. So, again, Running Tide is really working to amplify this biological pump. And then just to mention, because Jason, you were asking about opportunities for Massachusetts. Massachusetts, you also mentioned world-class universities, and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution is one of the most predominant oceanographic institutions in the world, and is also doing quite a bit of research on ocean carbon dioxide removal. Running Tide is definitely working in partnership with them and developing projects where we can be researching CDR technology. And then Massachusetts, as we know, already also has this emerging offshore wind industry. And there's a lot of infrastructure being developed around that, including ports. And I think there could be great opportunities to work to have that infrastructure be multi-purpose. So I see a lot of opportunity for Massachusetts and in ocean carbon dioxide removal. Thank you.
Okay, Conor, please.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity to participate and for Senator Creem's leadership in this area. I'll come at this from a couple different lenses because I'm probably on the periphery to a certain extent with what we're doing at CarbonBuilt. But in addition to removing carbon dioxide from the oceans, I think removing it from the air is another big opportunity. And And we see a lot of companies that are now emerging in this direct air capture space. And essentially what that technology entails is using, I'll say, varying approaches to pulling CO2 from ambient air and then having a CO2 stream or compressed, kind of air opportunity to then do something with it. And I think there's been a lot of exploration about putting it into the ground. And in our case at CarbonBuilt, we're really focused on not only storing that carbon dioxide away in concrete, but utilizing it to make products. And I think, in the concrete application, we're taking carbon dioxide and essentially converting it into calcium carbonate. So if you want to picture interweaving limestone into your concrete blocks or into your concrete ready mix, that's the core of what we're doing. And it's a great mechanism to partner with some of these technologies and be somewhat technology agnostic, though I think looking at the future, you could picture direct air capture units at ready mix plants, at block plants, and have that be where the ingredient comes from to not only improve our atmosphere and at the same time have it be good for business.
Great. Could you talk a little bit about what the bill in particular would enable for the methods that you're working with to come to fruition?
I don't know if you want to go reverse order here, but I guess
sure. Yeah, please. Let me do that. Conor, and then Sandra, and then Noah.
I can kick it off. So, I think a big piece of this is these are emerging technologies, and so when you think of direct air capture in particular, it's something that has not achieved a significant level of scale or even sophistication in the technology, and to work its way down the cost curve, you really need to subsidize in some way. And so these advanced commitments, I think, are not only affording the opportunity to make the economics work, but really, I think, de-risk projects as a whole. And when you kind of pull those things together, gives us an opportunity to make some projects happen that wouldn't normally occur, and in terms of just basic business economics. And so, by having these incentives out there, having the carrot, if you want to think of it that way, I think it helps to accelerate everything, and also gives an important market signal that these are the things that are important to our communities and to our government, and we really need to think about how to change and evolve, because in the case of concrete, we've been doing things the same way for an awful long time, and we're seeing a taste of what could be done differently. And as we do that, we may be reverting to centuries ago in terms of some of the thought process that folks had, back in some of the earliest construction, but now we're going to come at it from a different angle with a whole different set of tools to really make a difference.
Yeah, thank you. I think, and this was a little, I think, just also mentioned in the chat, this question about do no harm. And I think one of the things that the legislation does, which is really important, is highlight this and the fact that we really need to understand and minimize impacts. And those are not just environmental impacts, but also community impacts. And we can do this in part through research. We can do it with modeling. It's very important that this is an iterative process where we're really just trying to take, relatively small steps, a small project, a small research project, review it, change it, monitor it, modify it, and also learn how to mitigate any potential impacts. The second piece of the second thing that I think is really important in this bill is this question of monitoring and verifying. We can't necessarily sell a carbon credit for whatever price. I know there's one defined in the legislation if you can't actually, monitor it and verify it. I wouldn't go to the supermarket and buy a container of milk for $2 or $3 if I knew whether I was getting a pint or a gallon. So that's a very important part of the legislation, in my opinion.
Great. I think one of the things to follow up on Sandra's report we have when thinking about agricultural settings and specifically thinking about how we can have enhanced weathering in agricultural systems as a form of carbon dioxide removal, we have a fair amount of trials from academic universities now at this point that are several years long that demonstrates that this can have benefits to the farmers, can have benefits on yields, and will remove carbon dioxide. But one of the things that really needs to happen to have this increase in scale is improving our ability to actually track the amount of carbon dioxide removal for this. So having a program that will allow this to expand and will allow kind of proposed means of coming up with robust rates of carbon dioxide removal in something that is not run by not only an academic endeavor is really essential step forward. So I think the kind of what this allows is to move from academic trials where there's a tremendous amount of excitement and grow into something that can actually help farmers in the state of Massachusetts and remove carbon as it grows.
Awesome. Thanks all. We're going to move a little bit to audience Q&A now. Looks like we've had quite a few questions come in, and Chris, looks like there's a couple policy-oriented items that you wanted to address.
Yeah, there's some very great questions from the audience here, really substantive, and we're pleased to answer them, and really good to get the panel's feedback as well.
And the senator's feedback.
And the senator, fantastic, excellent. So we have some very specific questions. I'm just going to go in order in which they came in. So one from Rocio is, Senator, will you include other greenhouse gases in your bill, such as methane removal? If you want to take a first go at that, Senator, you can, but we can also explain what we know of what's in the language of the bill.
Well, I'm on mic. So the bill focuses on carbon removal because carbon is more common greenhouse gas. It lasts longer than methane. There wasn't an anticipation of adding something else, but when a bill goes, if that gets incorporated into some climate bill and it goes through Ways and Means, it often has a different iteration than it started with. So I can't say yes or no. My answer would have been no, but I don't know. We see where it's moving. And if there's going to be a bill, maybe another carbon bill, and this be part of it. I know that's not the best answer. I mean, I was happy with it just talking about carbon removal. That was the intent. Yeah.
And just to add to that, and Jason and others can as well, is that methane abatement and removal are incredibly important. This is a very, very potent greenhouse gas, and that, we're well aware of that. And it is a much more nascent solution type than what we're seeing with this explosion of carbon removal. But there is really, really exciting research and pre-commercial developments in that end. And I think the way that Senator Creem just mentioned it is the right way to think about it. As we go into rules and as we put this into place, we can look at the state of market and technology development. And there are methods for converting based on the power of the greenhouse gas to do what we call a CO2 equivalent. And so it is possible to basically fungibly look at methane, and that is certainly a direction that this could take. And we don't think that the way the bill is currently written, that it would preclude the inclusion of methane going forward. Great.
Okay.
So we have a couple of other things. If you want me to just go through them, Jason, I think it would be
please.
Good.
Yeah. Well, let's address the questions that came up, please.
So Melissa has a great question about standards-based tech agnostic sounds great, but standards for this are still highly uncertain, with development relying on new and evolving technologies. How do you plan to avoid the virtually endless pitfalls in the current carbon validation space? There's a couple of different ways to answer it. And one is to say anybody who spends any time in carbon removal realizes that what we call MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification, and standard setting are so central to this enterprise and are such a point of innovation and thinking around the world. If you're in Europe right now, talking at the EU level, if you're talking at the national level here or at the state level, figuring this part out is critically important. And there's a lot of impressive work that's emerging from the private sector and a lot of thinking about this going on at the national level as well. But to that point, I think that this is part of the leadership piece, is that we need these to be figured out by state actors. This is a huge part of the work that would go in before implementation. And we think that the role for state and federal and government actors to really set those standards and to make sure that they comply with what our net zero goals are, as well as our social and economic goals. So while there are gaps to be closed here, we think that the entry of a state like Massachusetts into what it can bring is actually going to help accelerate good design around standard-based tech agnostic selection. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that. It's a huge subject. I see, Noah, you put your hand up.
Yeah, maybe. So drawing an example from enhanced weathering, I think there's a fair amount of consensus from the scientific community and from the other key stakeholders in the space of what you would need to have constraints on to demonstrate that you do have robust carbon dioxide removal. So in some case, the question is not trying to come up with what would be best practices that could be enacted as part of this. The question is really, is it going to be feasible to implement those at scale? Mm-hmm. So in some cases, I think there's a lot of things that have to go into to continually to improve standards. And I think it is beneficial to think of standards as something that does evolve, but in many cases it's implementation and having protocols that reflect standards that's going to be the work, rather than coming up with kind of what are best practices, what do we know is going to be the things that we got to demonstrate to make sure we have robust removal.
If I can add to that, just with respect to running tides technology and recognizing that MRV is very important, we actually think of that somewhat as like quantification and mitigation, because you can also, you can design to mitigate. And one of the examples I'll use, there's some concern that if you have a growing chunk of seaweed out in the ocean that's going to shade, it's going to make some shade, and that's going to negatively impact the phytoplankton. So one of the easy ways to mitigate that is have the growing chunks of seaweed be quite small. So it's not, their technology is not something the size of a dining room table. It's something the size of a disc about this big. So light is going to be able to get underneath it more easily. So, sometimes you can avoid impacts by designing your technology to avoid, to preclude them in advance.
Excellent. Conor?
Yeah, I would just layer on that, there is a kind of unique ability to quantify some of what we're doing in the concrete space, is you're able to take material and do analysis on the makeup of that material kind of before and after going through some sort of carbonation process, and actually come up with some hard facts as to what got mineralized into your concrete is an example. Obviously, to kind of net everything out, you need to look at your process emissions change. You need to look at where the CO2 came from, and kind of ensure that pipeline makes sense and is renewable in nature in terms of any of the inputs. And at the end of the day, I think you can quantify all of that together, including some of the avoidance characteristics in your mix design, which is probably the most straightforward piece. When you pull out a bunch of high embodied carbon cement and you put in these other materials that are activated as binders using CO2, you inherently are able to exclude some very carbon intensive materials from going in the first place. So I think again, all of this needs to get measured, netted out. There needs to be third parties, whether it's government in nature or it's private public entities that are kind of looking over your shoulder and agreeing that your methodologies make sense. But assuming we can do that, there's plenty of smart folks that have worked through some of the logistics of how to do the math to come up with the right figures.
Yeah, and I want to actually jump to Meg's excellent questions, where she cites an example of a recent sort of controversial moment that happened in the UK around a particular form of carbon removal called ocean alkalinity enhancement. And I think one of the really important parts about this bill is that it avoids those types of outcomes, where it doesn't just have, here's a CDR provider that wants to do a local project. What this does is it creates a transparent government-sanctioned, government co-developed framework and a transparent way to show which proposals are coming in How have they been evaluated along ecological, environmental, and social goals? And this is why we selected it. So in addition to the demand creation, it's the clarity and the government sanctioning of a method in a transparent way is going to prevent exactly the types of outcomes that Meg, that you shared in that example. That is a really, really key point, I think, to make, and one of the benefits of having a public procurement pathway here. Go ahead, Noah.
I think one thing to add on that as well, going back to, again, agricultural settings, is in many cases what we're trying to do is modify current practices that are inducing a fair amount of harm right now. So what we're doing when trying to modify or trying to come up with best practices for soil pH management is coming up with a way to remove that from a totally free market to a case where you are minimizing the amount of nutrient runoff to your system that we know is causing pollution in streams, in coastal oceans, etc. So in some cases, there are cases where you'll want to move through a procedure that is something that is truly new practice. And in other cases, we're trying to modify a currently very harmful practice and reduce the carbon footprint of that practice in the same time. And those can develop in some ways because of the level of societal buy-in and key stakeholder buy-in at different paces.
And I just like to add, at the risk of stating the obvious, you have to look at the carbon footprint, not only in the ultimate, in this case for running tide, sinking the seaweed, how much carbon did you actually get to the bottom, but throughout the whole supply chain, how much carbon did you have to use to get that seaweed on a ship and take it out to where it's going to be sunk. And you have to really look at this in a holistic manner.
Yeah. The life cycle, the LCA or life cycle assessment of any of these technologies is crucial, as everyone just noted, the measurement, reporting, and verification, the MRV aspect of each of the methods, which can vary from CDR method to CDR method. Chris, looks like we've still got a couple more questions.
Yeah, there's a couple of really, really good ones here too that I think one of the things that we're very proud about this bill, and that Michelle Hung has asked the question, can you elaborate more on the bill's environmental justice and community engagement report? As soon as I can multitask, I'm actually going to copy some of the language from the bill about that, but it does that in a few different ways, some explicit, some implicit. One is that it actually has very, very strong safeguards, and the process by which we would develop a third-party independent audit will be co-developed actually by environmental justice officers within the state government. And then any project that could be subjected to an audit and reviewed during the proposal phase, if it doesn't pass muster with those standards, then it's either penalized or disqualified. So we actually involve the part of state government that's focused on equity and environmental justice in the actual development of the review. The other part too, as I mentioned with the multivariate scorecard, it actually adds, if you can demonstrate that there's economic or ecological or public safety benefits that might come from an environmental justice community, that gets scored. That gives an advantage to a project. And a third part that we're really excited about that relates to multiple forms of projects, we build in that a certain percentage have to be small scale. And that might not say it explicitly in the bill, but that opens up for models like modeled after something that Massachusetts has led on, things like community solar, cooperative energy. There's an amazing cooperative energy thing that really has taken place that started in Massachusetts. How amazing it would be if we had cooperatively owned forms of carbon removal that frontline communities and communities throughout the state can directly. That's a different way of thinking about equity, not just equity and fairness, but actually having an ownership stake. So we think that the way the bill is written right now, safeguards and opportunity is what it creates for projects across Massachusetts, but with a specific focus on environmental justice. And I think we do have one more question that we can answer, which
we only have a couple minutes, but one last question quick.
We can't go into this in depth. And Judy, I'm so glad you're on here. Judy's an amazing OpenAir member, and she asked, what specifically, says concretely, might the concrete procurement process look like? The documents that have been shared here will elaborate, but any of the folks that are on this panel right now, would be in a position where every year there's a certain amount of carbon dioxide removal that the state is going to buy. And that would be a portfolio, not a single type of project. and they would submit to the application process, this is what our carbon removal will be. This is how we verify it. And the state can pick different types of projects every year so that there's a range of different forms of carbon removal. So that could be something like the amazing project that I mentioned in Arizona that Conor's group, who's from Massachusetts and lives in Massachusetts, I think we didn't mention, has a third generation owned family concrete company in Flagstaff, Arizona, installing a direct air capture technology, a small one, with their CarbonBuilt technology, pulling carbon right out of the air and putting it forever in blocks. That type of project, a subject that I know Senator Creem is really, really interested in, low carbon concrete, that's the kind of project that you could actually see potentially being part of the procurement process, as well as a range of other things like what Noah and Dr. Whitehouse described. So a lot more detail to be worked out on that, but the portfolio approach of local projects, I think, is incredibly exciting. So yeah, that's all of our questions. But
and with that, yeah.
I don't know if we have a quick second for me to build on that, but we've actually got a project that's we've applied for some funding for a pilot program right here in Massachusetts in conjunction with Boston Sand and Gravel to do some of what I think Chris was describing. We got to be able to take CO2 and use it not only into products but into ready mix, and we're excited to collaborate right here in the state. And I think it has, not only opportunity that it creates in terms of industry around carbon removal as a whole, but then the downstream effects of being able to use it in products, and concrete happens to be incredibly hyper local in terms of the aggregates, the labor, all the different pieces that go into it can displace things that might come from great distance away. So we're excited for the opportunity here.
Okay, and with that, we are exactly at the top of the hour. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Senator Creem in particular, to Garrett, Casey in Senator Creem's office, to Chris, to Toby at OpenAir Collective, to Dr. Whitehouse, to Dr. Klonovsky, to Conor, and to you, our attendees. So looking forward to the House and Senate hearings on Wednesday and Thursday this week for us to talk a little bit more about what S2096 does. All right. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.